So what a great opportunity this is to kind of begin and renew, so to speak, and having this opportunity to be a part of your lives this evening. My name is Rich West, and I'm a professor here in the Department of Communication Studies at Emerson. I'm also the past president of the National Communication Association. Some of you already know that NCA is the largest academic organization that is dedicated to communication in all of its forms. We also look at advancing communication through humanistic, social scientific, as well as aesthetic inquiry. Our offices are located in Washington, D.C., but we're neither a political nor a corrupt organization, clearly differentiating ourselves from other organizations in our nation's capital. So indeed, welcome to what we're calling Clarifying Conversations. And this is a signature event with the National Communication Association, and I am terribly proud to be a part of it. During the busiest time of the academic year, I'm also really happy to see so many of you here tonight and for this interactive discussion that we're about to have on race and identity and how it's represented through the many facets of our contemporary culture. We are coming to you tonight from Boston. However, because we're streaming this live, we wish to welcome the others who've also tuned in online. And as of this afternoon, we've heard from people from over 22 states and 3 countries outside of the United States. So we welcome especially our domestic and our international viewers and listeners. Finally, a special shout out to the students who are here and online who are watching tonight. We are especially hopeful that as you consider the thoughts and ideas expressed here tonight, that you actually reflect on them and think about the different opportunities and the different possibilities available to you and to all of us. One of the issues regarding tonight is really a long-standing interest of mine, and it continues to be, which is the broad dissemination of communication scholarship to influence and inform public policymaking in the United States. Currently, I remain committed to addressing and unraveling the complexities of a number of cultural issues, themes, and ideas. So tonight's program, my NCA presidential initiative called Clarifying Conversations, is the first of what I hope will be an ongoing process of infusing our disciplinary perspectives into timely discussions about public policy and other critical issues that are facing our nation today. Tonight's conversation is moderated by Professor Harvey Young of Northwestern University, and it would examine how race and identity are represented, articulated, constituted, and enacted in various ways in our culture. Before I introduce Dr. Young, I first want to thank Emerson College for hosting tonight's event. I also want to thank our panelists who have traveled here from across the nation for participating in this important discussion and for sharing their unique scholarship, their unique ideas, and their unique insights. I also would like to acknowledge President Pelton, who's our esteemed Emerson president, who together with the rest of us here at Emerson, the administrators, the staff, the students, and the faculty, we've all embraced and advanced these sorts of conversations we're about to listen to tonight. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Professor Harvey Young. Dr. Young is an associate professor in the Department of Theater at Northwestern University and is currently in Cambridge as a faculty fellow at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. An award-winning author and an internationally recognized authority on African American culture and the performing arts, Professor Young is the author of Embodying Black Experience and Theater and Race, and is also the co-editor of the books Performing in the Borderlands and Reimagining A Raisin in the Sun, 4 new plays. I'm thrilled to have Professor Young as our facilitator tonight, and I'm eager to listen to the various perspectives, examples, and ideas from our esteemed panelists. So, Professor Young.
Hi, thanks. Thank you. Hello. Hi, welcome everyone to this NCA Clarifying Conversation. Today's topic is focused upon race and how it operates within contemporary American culture. As a way of offering a sense of what we're going to do today, I want to sort of give you the blueprint for our discussion. And the blueprint is that we're going to have 5 amazing, spectacular, gifted, wonderful panelists, and each person here to my left, to your right, is a person whose professional work and achievements interrogate and force us to think critically, about how race operates in American culture. So we're going to have a conversation that's going to be a free-flowing exchange and dialogue. We're going to talk up here for about, 45 minutes, 50 minutes. And then what's going to happen is that there's going to be a question and answer period. And the Q&A, I invite people who are here at the Bordy Theater here in Boston to sort of walk up, when I prompt you to make use of the microphones here and ask questions of our panelists. But also, many people are watching this event via the internet. And you can also participate in the Q&A by sending us your questions, tweeting them, posting questions through Facebook, and this is how you do it. You write your question, and our Twitter hashtag is NCA Conversations. And what I'll do is I'll integrate those questions into the Q&A that occurs here at the Bordy Theater. But let's kick things off. We'll kick things off with some introductions. To my left, to your right, is Tom Nakayama. And Tom is a professor of the Department of Communication Studies at Northeastern University. He's a leading scholar of international communication and also in critical studies of whiteness. Next to Tom is Ann Demo. Ann is the assistant professor in Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University. And Ann's work explores the relationship between visual and digital rhetoric and US cultural politics. Next to Ann is Kimberly McLarin, Emerson's own. Kimberly is an assistant professor in the Department of Writing, Literature, and Publishing. She's an award-winning author and a former journalist. And many people who are here will have seen her on, Basic Black, right? Next to Kimberly is Angharad Valdivia, who is the department head of Media and Cinema Studies within the Institute for Communication Research at the University of Illinois. So she's in my neck of the woods, over in Illinois. And Angie's work centers on the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and transnational studies, an examination of media and popular culture. And last, but certainly not least, is Jeff Schaffer. Jeff is a producer, a writer, and director for film and television. He's written for a number of shows, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Seinfeld. And he's currently the executive producer of the FX series, The League. So please join me in welcoming our 5 fantastic panelists.
I am here as your mental warm down. So.
All right. And it's, the hashtag for the Twitter is NCA Conversations within us. Thank you. So in light of this is the great transition, for our first question, which I'm directing to Tom, but all the panelists are welcome to join in. So the fact that we are here having a conversation at the Bordy Theater, sponsored by the NCA, as part of Rich's presidential initiative, and I'm so thankful for Rich for having this occur. Many of you did not know that this event was scheduled for last year. And then events occurred that meant that it had to be canceled. And it was the bombing that occurred with the Boston Marathon. And because of the commitment to NCA, to having this conversation, to realizing how important it is for us to be in a room together, both physically, present, but also virtually, to talk about sort of race and how it impacts everyday life, they worked diligently to restage and recreate this event. So I think it's extraordinarily important for us to be here. The fact that we are all here and we can participate in this conversation both virtually and in present, begs a question for Tom, right? Which is, how have evolving media technologies sort of changed the way and influenced the way that that sort of race is talked about in terms of and communicated within everyday life?
I guess I want to say a couple of things about that. In the last couple of decades, as I've been studying issues of race, I guess when I look back on some of my earlier work, I really didn't anticipate what was going to happen with the internet and the development of the communication technologies and the ways that it's really shaped and really framed the discussion about race in a particular kind of way. So one of the things I think is really important, and when we think about the development, for example, of new media here in the United States, is the way that we took a certain path here, which is embracing freedom of speech. And so in other countries, France, for example, it's illegal to post or tweet racist stuff. It's illegal. Whereas we don't have that restriction here, which means that on Twitter, for example, people can tweet whatever they want to tweet, and they do. But I think it's important because it's an important ground upon which we negotiate how we think about a lot of the issues about race. And so one of the examples that we saw recently was in the 2014 Super Bowl. Coca-Cola ran an ad in which they had people sing America the Beautiful in 8 different languages. And Twitter, of course, lit up with lots of angry people who were boycotting Coke, said they're never going to drink it again. But what I was more interested in is, okay, so here is the ground upon which we're discussing what it means to be American, where race fits in, language, and all of these other issues, because there were many people complaining that the national anthem should never be sung in any other language than English. Of course, America the Beautiful is not our national anthem. And English, minor point.
Right.
And of course, English is not our official language in the United States. And yet, somehow defining speaking English as is essential to being American was part of that discussion. And then some of the same strategies of negation that we noted earlier, 20-something years ago when we first worked on whiteness, were operating there too, in terms of defining what is American. Well, it's not. And then there were lots of tweets defining what American means. It's not Jews, it's not African Americans. They didn't use the African American word. It's not Mexicans, it's not all of these other groups, meaning that being part of what is being American is being white. And so on Twitter, other people feel a responsibility to respond to some of these comments, and there's a vigorous debate that goes on Twitter. And I think it's an important site where we're negotiating what these different things mean, what race means, language, what it means to be American. And this Coke ad is just one example of that explosion of tweets where we're coming to these decisions. And so I know that I think one of the problems, and maybe some other people have some ideas about this with Twitter, is that there's an explosion of tweets because it's very episodic and everybody wants to talk about the Super Bowl ad, but then the interest in that wanes pretty quickly. And so I'm not sure what happens to that as an arena for deliberation. Whereas if it were illegal, as in France, then they could have a more, is it possible to have a more vigorous discussion about the limits of what is and isn't postable on Twitter? If it was on the level of legal discourse as opposed to just, we're going to tweet and then I'm not interested in that topic anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I am really glad we're starting with this as a point of conversation as well. And I was actually thinking of two other examples, one being the NBA Finals, where a young boy wearing a mariachi outfit sang the national anthem. And then I'm from Fayetteville, New York, and the Miss America for this past year is also from Fayetteville, New York, and she is of Indian descent. And so you saw that kind of hate stroll through Twitter that goes through that. But I actually think that we can also think about the role of platforms for offering a point of opening for conversation. So you have Twitter and the kind of hate stream that circulates potentially through Twitter, on YouTube sites, but then you also have the mainstream news now pivoting from tweets and what's happening, what's trending on social media. So then it becomes a story subsequently on NPR or the Today Show. And so I do think part of this conversation definitely needs to be a critique and a sense of how we can develop affordances in the technology to then limit that kind of hate stream, but then also think about, well, what are the opportunities? What are the opportunities in terms of pan-mediation, not just what's happening on the internet, but then you go and it's picked up on these other mediums, and a kind of more meaningful conversation potentially can arise. And the second kind of point that I think I'd like to throw out there is this notion of what kind of affordances can be hardwired into our conversations and into our platforms. So I worked with, worked on a chapter that looked at a debate in, it was in Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C., and it was a filmmaker who basically, instead of doing a documentary film and showing it after the debate happened, he started streaming the B-roll as the debate was unfolding, and it became a catalyst for a community conversation. And so these are kind of opportunities that can also be maybe, I don't know if legislated, but certainly as creative people, as people who are in industry, thinking about this really outside the box and what kind of opportunities that can also pose. Certainly the hate stream is there, but are there maybe opportunities as well?
Right. Kimberly?
I mean, the hate stream, oh, sorry, go.
No, I would just say very briefly, I agree with what both have said. My concern often with what happens on Twitter in particular and social media in general when these conversations comes up is how it becomes, I think Joyce Carol Oates and other people have used the lynch mob mentality, right? And the larger problem is that it becomes an individual issue, right? People attack this individual as being racist, and once we shame this individual as being racist, then we've taken care of our problem.
Right.
So that's my concern, is that we like, it's like the young woman who tweeted something stupid before she got on a plane to South Africa. I can't remember exactly what she tweeted.
Sacco.
God forbid, the poor thing. I mean, I'm sure I can't even remember what she said. It was clearly offensive. But by the time she landed, the whole world had piled on her. And once we'd driven her into the ground, then we can all sit back and say, well, we've taken care of the problem. When of course, racial inequality and racial inequity is a much bigger problem than individual racial prejudice. So that's my caution with Twitter as a means of dialogue about racial justice, is that it's often, let's drill down on Paula Dean, and let's drill down on this individual, and then we can all feel good about ourselves because
Well, also I think it's hard to have an actual discussion on Twitter, because Twitter, you've got the shield of anonymity, so there's no face-to-face discussion, so there's no real, oh, I actually know someone, or there's no actual experience there, it's just hiding behind something. And it'd be great if obviously people could talk in person and leave the internet to what it was designed for, which is pictures of, videos of cats trying to fall asleep and pornography.
And what you had for lunch, yeah.
But I mean, isn't there also, with some cases like with Black Twitter, where if there is some kind of intervention that needs to happen, then there can be a kind of onslaught. It is that kind of jump on mentality. So, I
Sometimes.
definitely, but get your point, and I think the really important point that I'm hoping we'll really emphasize is the erasure of any kind of structural inequality conversation that just seems impossible in social media.
It seems like that part of the challenge with Twitter, and this is what I'm sort of sensing, in the conversation here, is the speed, sort of how quickly the message gets out. And how the sense of not only can something, be shared 12,000 times or 50,000 times, but there's a sense of the person being sort of to use the phrase, sort of piled upon, right? So let's talk about that. So how does this sort of rapid communication, afforded by new media technologies, sort of shift the way in which we can engage complex topics like race?
Well, I guess I want to start by saying that Twitter, it is a new technology. But it falls on the tradition and history of previous technologies, and as such, it's not that different from other technologies in that it's a form of communication, and it's a form that has democratic potential, but it also has hate potential. And so all forms of communication have that. We can't just single out Twitter as that, because we could say the same thing about the telegraph, we could say the same thing about radio, television. In terms of the space-time compression issue that you're talking about, and the kind of cultural implications of speeded up communications where people post things before they think about it. I'm not quite sure that they're anonymous. We recently had an incident at the University of Illinois where the chancellor posted that she didn't want to call a snow day because we just don't have snow days at the University of Illinois. That's just not the way we roll. You know what I mean? And she got hate mail back, right? And the hate mail became something about her ethnicity. She's Asian American. And about the fact that she's a woman, and about her age. And a lot of the people that were posting on Facebook and on Twitter were posting under their real names. So we are reading them like, we know who you are. You're in my class. Do you know that you're posting under your real name? And I think that's one of the issues that we find in the classroom nowadays, is that a lot of our students don't seem to think that that's even important, and the ramifications of the lack of anonymity of so many of these forms of communication, right? And the fact that the speed and the potential long-lastingness of, but also it can also disappear, right? We've all, as faculty, watched whole websites disappear, never to be retrieved again. And so I guess people count on that, but it is a kind of a intangible, tangible kind of communication where it immediately appears, and I guess people hope that it'll disappear. It's anonymous, it's not anonymous, and it represents a racial climate that's going on in our culture. So yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons that we feel an obligation to respond, though. because we're setting the norms for that racial climate. And so whether it's a Super Bowl ad or the non-snow day at University of Illinois, there's an explosion of Twitter stuff, but people feel the need to respond to try and set the norms in a different kind of way. And that's probably why we just have this explosion around this episode, and then we move on to something else.
And what is the potential, in terms of the positive potential for, and this is a general question, for sort of Twitter or other forms of communication to actually move things in a positive, in a more hopeful manner, right? So rather than sort of shaming people or critiquing them, or you having 12,000 people sort of oppressing another person and then silencing them just through their, excessive tweets. You might think of like Trayvon Martin, for example, and how maybe there's a community of people that were rallied around social media, to sort of make that case a national news story. So are there other sort of examples in which sort of the fast-paced nature of communication, allows for a level of progress in terms of the racial dialogue, sort of pushing a politics that hasn't happened before. Certainly there has been, to pick up on Angie's points, there's been sort of increasingly faster means of communication, right? But there's never been anything as fast as this right now, right? So what about that instantaneous community that can be created through these forms?
Well, with the example that I was giving in the controversy in Washington, or right outside of Washington, what was interesting is that, so that this documentary filmmaker started using YouTube, and then there were these comments, and what happened is that the comments were for the kind of very polarized, kind of small YouTube clip that went viral, very much hate streamed. But the comments that were in relationship to a county board of supervisor decision that the community needed to know about, but it wasn't being covered on mainstream television, it wasn't being covered in the local newspaper, that access needed to happen. And because it was such a polarized discussion in these county board of supervisors, people didn't feel comfortable speaking out, because you were getting hate speech at your face, kind of speaking up for immigrant rights. And so the secondary platforms that were created locally by people who connected through YouTube and then realized that, hey, we do have a coalition of people who want to stand up for immigrant rights, they kind of migrated to a smaller platform. And that's when things happened. The filmmaker also moderated the YouTube comments, and then would even actually take on a kind of pseudonym and then take people down. And so that there are these kind of opportunities of moving over in platforms. And so I don't think we should kind of just stick with Twitter or stick with Facebook, but I mean, there's a range of opportunities, in that it's not just a kind of one-way medium, it's one to many or many to many that can participate.
My next question is for Kimberly, and it picks up on something that Tom mentioned, right? You're sort of referring to that Coca-Cola Super Bowl commercial. And part of the concern about that commercial was all these people who who did not look appropriate, sort of singing along to the song, and that begs a question, how does assumptions of what is sort of racially appropriate? How do we think about race? How do we define race? How does whiteness, more specifically, factor into our conceptions of race? Because often that's what gets left out. But often it's the overpopulation, or so it seems, of different colored faces without thinking of whiteness as a color, that generates this critique. So how would you sort of tell a person, or how would you sort of describe the function of race in relationship to whiteness?
That's a very good question. I would first, I guess, remind white people that they are raced as well. I think that's really what it comes down to, right? Because my concern, the reason I brought this issue up, is when we have these conversations, we're always having these conversations about race. I think we need to have more of these conversations about race, but whiteness is often left out of that conversation, right? Because in the United States, whiteness is still the norm, it's still the default. I was just reading The New Yorker last night. It was a back copy. But if you read The New Yorker, you read The New York Times, you will still notice, still today, they notice when they identify someone who is white, they say John Smith. If they identify someone who is not white, they say John Smith, who is African American, right? That still happens today in The New Yorker, The New York Times, these places of record, because the default is assumed to be white, and anything that is not white is is substandard or extra standard and has to be noted. This stuff has an impact, right? And I talk with my students a lot about whiteness and how if we live in a racialized society, and my theory is that we still live in a very racialized society, then racialization affects everyone, and affects, more importantly, individually, it affects how you think. People often say to me, my students often say to me, well, of course you feel that way because you're black. And I say, yes, that's probably true. Part of the reason I think this way is because I'm black. But guess what? Part of the way you think that way, you think is because you're white, too. And that's the thing that's often missing. And it's important for us all to understand that our thinking and our reactions are shaped by our experiences and by who we are. And so I just want to make sure that these conversations about race don't become conversations about either A, what's wrong with people of color, or B, why are white people so mean to people of color? Which are two sides of the same coin, rather than questions about how race impacts our thinking as individuals and how that impacts justice and equality and all these other issues that I'm mostly concerned about. Because, again, just to go back to the issue of individualism, I'm less concerned about how, which is my concern about Twitter, is how individuals act or react than about how race affects opportunity in people's lives, people's real lives. And you cannot talk about that. You can't talk about the underprivileged without talking about the overprivileged. You can't talk about, race without talking about whiteness.
Isn't there a way that, like, with a meme like stuff white people like, or first world problems, that it's like seemingly to talk about privilege, but
Without
not
really
talking about
it.
privilege.
Right.
And so, I mean, I was trying to think about opportunities where it's not just academics talking about it, but that's like one place where I do think, like, my students read that just for fun, not for
Right.
class.
It's a joke. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And that's, I think, an important context for thinking about how we talk about race is the context of humor. And so in that case, with the, stuff white people like, I think it is this seeming discussion about privilege, but then it becomes like just laugh off, and there's no discussion of the structural inequality that makes,
Right. It's so
conducive.
interesting to see just what you were talking about whiteness. And I mean, the one thing I've noticed just traveling around in the South and Midwest and actually filming white supremacists is that they're white, but they're just so damn picky. It's that it's not just that you have to be white, you have to be this kind of white. And we were there with Sacha Baron Cohen as Bruno, who, being a Austrian, was very interested in helping this white supremacist get his message out. And so he's sitting there with him, and he's saying, well, we should really sort of film this and do some sort of propaganda film. And the guy said, that'd be great. And Bruno suggested, maybe we should get Spike Lee or Woody Allen to film this for you. And the guy just totally straight-faced just says, well, the Woody Allen I'm thinking of is a Jew. And it's just like, but he's white, and he's just like, all right, well, you're just a very picky man. You're never gonna be happy. That's you see on the very, and that's one of the things that we do with Sasha is you're right there with them, and you sort of coddle up to them, and you lie to them, and you say you're one of them, and then you just let them go, and it is incredible sitting in this man's house. Which later we found out, I tried to look and go, where are all the guns? You don't want to get shot and all that kind of stuff. But and we found them too late. Anyway, this was another story. But it is it's the whole point of those movies is to hold a mirror up to horrible human behavior and get a giant laugh out of it.
But is holding the mirror up to these extremists kind of defeating the point, right? Because those extremists are not really, I don't know. I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen the movie,
Right.
so I can't speak. Not that I'm not a fan. But by focusing on the extreme, on the white supremacists, on the few dwindling KKK members, are we really confusing the larger issue, which again is structural racial inequality?
Yes, but the other thing is, I guess one thing I would say in the movie is like,
Which is not funny,
You
so
go
it's
to,
kinda hard
but
to
no, but you
do a
can
movie
go. You
about
can
it.
also go to an army base in Alabama, or you're going on a hunting trip with some just everyday American hunters going to a shop, and you're just out there in the middle of a lot of times the South, because they don't recognize him there, and you're and casual conversations about things, and they just start to go. And then of course what we did with Bruno, a lot of these guys were saying that whether it's talking about race or talking about sexuality or whatever, and then we would turn the tables on when he revealed that he was gay, and they lost it. I mean, we had, there was a giant, we created a giant wrestling match with wrestlers, and it was this cage wrestling match, and we actually did it twice. We did it in Arkansas, one at Rogers, Arkansas, the other at Fort Smith. The first time we did it, basically, he was the MC as this other character, this character who was very homophobic, very sort of country, and they loved him, and he was great. And then in the middle of this, his ex-lover came out, and they started to fight, and then they started to kiss, and then they started to basically have sex right there in the middle of the thing and of the wrestling platform, and the audience lost their mind. And we actually had to stop the first one because they were throwing all of their chairs at us, even though we had giant fence. Then we realized, oh, we have to have more fence. We have to have fence that goes up and over. But you just and we did that once, and we did it the second time. We actually lashed the chairs down. They still got the chairs out, and Sasha almost got nailed a few times. And we thought, okay, we've got this. We've actually captured it. What we didn't realize was that we had basically performed an entire wrestling show with lots of other wrestlers, and we thought, well, we're safe from the crowd. But we didn't realize was all the wrestlers that had been performing didn't then realize, oh, now we're part of this too, and they were backstage with us. So it was again another very tense escape in a bus getting out of town, like with them chasing us.
I want to pull back for a second, and we have some great clips, from Curb Your Enthusiasm and The Dictator, but we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there in a few minutes. But I want to pull back a bit and talk about how a person understands themselves as raced, right? Because there's a way in which we can often think about race as this sort of abstract concept, right? But what I'm hearing here is that, when you actually understand how race is lived and embodied every day, right? It's walking around certain neighborhoods and then having a conversation. Something you say, all of a sudden means you're a member of the club or not in the club, right? So, thinking about helping everyone to understand their social identity and how that informs their behavior, informs their possibilities. What strategies can we offer? And this is a general question.
I have an exercise that I do with my students. I'll just tell you very quickly. You write down, you take a little piece of paper, you tear it into 7 strips. You write down your race, your ethnicity. For some people that's different, for some people it's not. Your gender, your sexuality, your nationality, and your disability status. You put them on little piece of papers, and then you take one that you say, if I had to give up one of these aspects of my identity, which one would it be? You ball it up and you throw it on the floor. And then you keep doing that until you get down to 1. And you pay attention to where it gets difficult. And then you ask yourself, because what often happens in my class when I do this is that the white students very inevitably will throw away whiteness very early because it doesn't mean anything to them. But then you have to say, well, that's easy to say, right? But what would it really, that means you can no longer be white. Imagine yourself, or whatever, as something other, and then it really starts to, you really have to think about it, right? So I just throw that out there as an exercise, right? It's easy to say being white or being black or being male, being able-bodied doesn't mean anything to me because it doesn't mean anything to you because you don't have to think about not being that thing. And so imagine what it would mean to not be that thing and how would that affect your everyday interactions. Then people start to, you'd be surprised what comes up. It's very interesting.
So it's a way of seeing how your social identity consists of many layers.
Many layers.
Right? Many layers. And that one's ability to...
And how people perceive you, right. So it's not just about how you think about yourself. So, I would have no problem being, well, maybe I would, sorry, I was going to say a man, no offense. But then you have to, not just how I perceive myself, but how then people are going to perceive me differently too, right? That's important. So the double consciousness that Du Bois talks about.
Now, something happened that was really interesting here. When you said, sort of about seeing yourself as a man, right? There was this moment of laughter, right? It was a chuckle. And it seems as though whenever we sort of have these conversations about what sort of social identity sort of means, like for a person to inhabit a certain type of body, that moment it gets articulated creates a level of anxiety that results in some discomfort. Like, how do I respond to that? So you laugh, right?
Right.
And we know and we've already sort of got a teaser of this, that comedy is a form that actually allows us to interrogate the really difficult and tense subject matter, right? So you can think of the various news channels that exist in Comedy Central as a way of allowing us access to things that are often quite difficult to work through. So in that spirit of talking about sort of how comedy engages these tough issues, I would like us to look at a clip from Curb Your Enthusiasm, and then we'll talk about it shortly thereafter.
Sheriff! Hello, boy.
You
He's a cutie. What the hell?
I think it's you, Wanda.
One of y'all want to grab Cujo?
Come on, it's just Wanda. It's just Wanda.
I'm sorry. He's very friendly.
We're all done in there. Just you have to wait overnight for the.
Hey, little buddy, come here.
What's wrong with your dog?
I don't know. See how friendly he is?
Good dog. Probably smells my dog. Oh!
Hey, oh my God! Guy, come on. Get over here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. What'd you do? I'm really sorry.
It's okay.
I don't know what's going on.
I've never seen him like this.
I'm really sorry.
You know what's going on.
Huh?
You have a racist dog. That dog hates black people.
Wanda.
There, you trained the dog to hate black
No,
people.
I didn't train it to hate black people.
Has it barked at any white people?
No, he's.
So he hasn't barked. at
Exactly.
anyone.
Your dog is racist.
Sheriff's racist?
Sheriff? That's a perfect name for a racist dog. Where'd you get this dog? The Klan meeting or something?
That's good. So that leads me to ask Jeff, when writing comedy, how do you tackle this issue that it can be really thorny and upsetting for people of race?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. It's a very sensitive issue, and it presents a minefield of perilous situations, and that's why it is a comedy just goldmine. And so you hit it head on. I mean, anytime, for a comedy writer, anytime people are offended or uncomfortable, the comedy writer should be right there sort of, detailing that like a war correspondent. But usually you're actually sort of embedded in your own life. For that, for instance, my assistant, that's based on my assistant's dog, a lovely little Jack Russell Terrier. We had an office, her door opened up to the hallway, and anytime a Hispanic person or an African American person walked by, he would growl and bark like there was no tomorrow. And she was mortified, and because of course it reflects on her. It's like, well, if you can teach them to sit, you can teach them to hate. So, and so we told her, I said, Kelly, there's good news and bad news. I mean, the bad news is you got a furry little Klansman there. Good news is you're going to get a story on Curb Your Enthusiasm. And that's what those are the stories we're always looking for, because race is everyone's so awkward about it. It's like it's like sex. Everybody wants to be better at it, but they're not quite sure how, and who do you talk to about it, and there's no handbook. And what you really need is a racial issue Kama Sutra, which we could make here tonight. We can figure this out, but then everyone would just sort of go, okay, here's what I'm supposed to be doing. Because a lot of times you don't know, and you don't even know who to ask.
Right.
So.
Right, and there's a way in which, sort of embarrassment about saying the wrong thing, right? That if I say something, and even if it comes from a sincere place, wanting to join the conversation, there's that worry that you might say something that will offend someone else, right? And the result is this sort of mortified silence, right? Where a person refuses to engage the conversation, to even talk to someone else about what they're thinking.
Right, there's a giant fear. We do that on Curb, and we did that on Seinfeld a lot too, and on The League also, which is there is that fear of saying the wrong thing and being accidentally perceived as racist. There's situations, here's one I don't think we've done yet, but we've sort of talked about it, which is, we sort of did it on Curb, which is someone says something racist, and then you're back with your friends and you're telling your group of friends what was said that was racist. But the very act of telling that racist thing over again, if that's overheard by someone else, then you're racist. So it just keeps going like this. We use that with the N-word. Larry overheard someone saying something terrible in the bathroom. He told his friend this. The African-American family who was staying with him overheard this, and all of a sudden, he's racist just for saying it. It's like, no, I was just saying it. Every time he said it, it was worse, and every time he said it, one more person heard it. And that, I think, for Larry being someone from a white person of privilege from the west side of Los Angeles, that's the worst thing that could ever happen. So we play with that. We play with that all the time. And in fact, we did a whole season where Larry and his wife Cheryl took in an African-American family after Hurricane Katrina. And we did it just so we could do these stories. We even named the family the Blacks, just so it was that much more awkward. As Larry said, he said, that's like if my name was Larry Jew. But we did that so we could try and hit as many of these in one season as we could.
Now, and the next clip we're going to look at is from The Dictator. Do you want to set that up at all?
Oh, so this is a different form of racism. This is actually, basically, all you need to know is Sacha Baron Cohen is playing a Gaddafi-type dictator who's lost his power. He's in New York, he's lost his power, no one recognizes him. He and his friend are trying to regain control, so they're going to scout the hotel where the bad guys live. And to do that, they need to go up in a helicopter. There's a helicopter tour of New York, which they're taking along with a lovely Midwestern couple.
I love being an American. America is number one. Oh, I am from USA. My father also from USA. My great-grandfather fought in the American Civil Jihad. I am very proud to be an American. I am America's #1 douche. C'était كانوا تاكل لكعبوا بقليبه وشكين بيد حناين شعلت عدك معنا شتايم عشان معك حجر بن لادن ايوه اسامه شعني اقول له عماد يا بن لادن شمر شعني سمين مع المشعر عشان تريح من شمر بن لادن تقدر انا ما ماشي متقاقع على بحونيوت شلي وانت بورشة ايوه 9/11 9/11 it's the best بياش خنزة علي بأوتو مع 9/11 ما شكرا ايوه انا كده ودخل انا said 9/11 2012
So that, I believe, was the first 9/11 joke in a mainstream comedy, which, you know, again, sort of going into this, is anything sacred? And just the answer is it can't be. Just can't be. And I think, you know, that's a joke, that's a scene that works entirely because everyone knows what Midwesterner, the assumption that Midwesterners have when they are around Arabs in a post 9/11 world. And these guys are actually talking about harmless stuff, and after that, a little after that in the clip, they start talking about, oh, you've got to see the sights in New York, Yankee Stadium, fireworks over the Statue of Liberty, boom, 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 and the Midwestern couple loses it. So, and they go to jail. So, but it's, that joke, again, only works because you're actually making fun of what Americans think every time they see, you know, someone who looks sort of overtly Muslim.
Right, so, and I want the whole panel to get involved in this one in terms of the question being, you know, is there anything that should be off limits in comedy, right? And it sounds as though, Jeff, what I hear you saying is that, you know, what makes that work, you know, extraordinarily well is that we're sort of imagining not ourselves reading that, but like some sort of stereotypical version of someone else, you know, who witnesses this, and we're like, oh, we're way more intelligent and insightful than that person we're imagining, and therefore we can sort of laugh at the person who's misreading.
Right, but if we're honest, we're probably also going, yeah, I've had certain feelings after, you know, and I think that's the other reason that it sort of works. You're laughing, oh yeah, I know people that are like that. But I think if you really went one level deeper, you go, yeah, I've done that. So.
Is there anything that's off limits in terms of comedy?
Well, I don't know why she wants me to lead on this one. What should be off limit? I guess I will answer it by way of saying that first you were talking about a third person effect where people say, well, you know, this doesn't affect me, but obviously everybody else is affected by it. And that's a media studies finding. The other thing about humor is that it's very hard from a media studies perspective, again, to understand how people are reading that humor, right? And so even in Curb Your Enthusiasm, and if you go back to something like The Cosby Show, or if you go back to All in the Family, humor that you and I would think that it you know, embodies racism, or even this coverage of this show that I also haven't seen about white supremacists. But what you find out when you do the research is that there are a lot of people in the audience who look at that and they get reinforcement for their racist view. So you're thinking they're laughing at racism, and what they're thinking is, I'm racist too, and it's all right to be racist because there it is, right there on the screen. And so humor I'd never like to say double-edged sword because that's too simplistic, but it's a multi-edged sword, and it's very hard for us to understand how it's working with different segments of the audience. So if I have to answer your question, really almost anything has got a potential that could be very unexpected, and sometimes in a progressive manner, and sometimes in a very kind of a repressive manner.
Yeah, I would just say briefly that I don't think anything's off limits. I mean, we have freedom of speech. That's a great thing about America. It's really good. Equally, what is not off limit is my critique of that kind of humor. So, and the defense can't be, well, you're oversensitive, or you just don't have a sense of humor, or come on, nothing is off limits. I'm not saying you would do this, but this is often when people in positions of privilege want to make fun of other people and then say, well, if you don't laugh at it, then you're just too sensitive or something like that. So it's not off limits, but my critique of that kind of humor, which I personally don't enjoy, is not off limits either. That's what I would say.
Well, I also think, like, from a macro point of view, if you look at our conversations right now that occur about race, it's often kind of through indirection or through humor or through code. So Paul Ryan talks about the inner city, and what you don't have is an explicit conversation. And so I don't think humor, anything's off topic, but I think you need to look diagnostically at, wow, isn't it interesting that when we talk about race, it's in these trajectories, and then what are we missing? And I think we're missing a lot. So that's
because maybe comedy isn't the space where you can have that deliberation that we need to have, the extended conversation about race.
Well, the one thing I would say also is that, and this is, I'll use an example from the league, which is, this is something that we just noticed that from watching a lot of football and a lot of sports. Here's something that you see all the time, which is black coaches are always called class acts. Lovie Smith, he's a class act. Tony Dungy, what a class act. White football players are always gym rats. And you hear it and you hear it. So that's something we put on the show. We had our guys talk about it, and now it's out there. And then
but it was out there before.
No, it was out there before. But I'm just saying. But the amount of it wasn't. But I'm saying the amount of that
black
now
people have been saying this for a long time, and black quarterbacks are always surprisingly intelligent, and
right.
White quarterbacks are Tom Brady. You know what I mean?
Right.
So,
and then, right, you say, well, black quarterback, and athletic, all those things. But
exactly,
by actually bringing that out, and people are laughing about it and stuff, then the amount of awareness, just from our small little amount of tweets, and we still, every time it happens, you're just watching on Sundays, whatever, and it's just boom, 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 and it's everyone notices it, and maybe if people notice it enough like that, then at least they go, that's really not right, and they'll at least watch. Maybe they won't say it again this time because they know that they're going to get made fun of.
And certainly there's a way in which the subtext that makes the humor work, right, is extremely complex, right? So the language of having sort of a sword with many sides, right? Not quite double-edged, but like having 30 edges or something like that. I think that works really well because it's, what we're doing is we're imagining, sort of the many different layers of prejudices and biases we have around a person's social identity, right? And then that's at play, right? So all of a sudden, when it's a place, when someone's calling Lovie Smith, sort of former coach of Bears, a class act, right? Then all of a sudden that means a lot, right? Because then you're talking about sort of expectations around and biases around sort of intelligence. Talking about sort of class status, talking about stereotypes of African American men, right? Being aware of the economy of the National Football League, and all these things are at play, right? So you can have that one phrase, right? And it sort of triggers all these things for you, right? In the same way that you can watch the scene from The Dictator, right? And it works because it's hitting us at so many different levels, right? And then some things people subscribe to, some things people do not just subscribe to, but the fact that everyone's complicit at some level, makes that humor hit, right? And I think that becomes the critical edge, that actually allows comedy to do a lot of stuff for us. The catch is, since it's so many different ways of engagement, it can be interpreted, both radically in the positive, or it can be, interpreted radically in the negative, right? And that's what makes it so contentious. What I want to ask Angie as a transition is that we have these media texts, right? We have these texts that sort of translate, they transfer and they move across the globe, right? And there's a way in which this sort of American conversation around sort of race and racism and prejudice and concerns around social identity, get exported, right? And my question for you is, can we talk a bit about, the role in which sort of this American racism, gets sort of spread, gets shared with other people in other national contexts, and how that can be interpreted differently?
All right. So if we could cue up the Disney image. Sorry, it's not a clip. It's just an image. And it's a couple of summers ago, Princess Protection Act. Selena Gomez and Demi Lovato, and I'll say a couple more things about those two Disney real-life princesses. But the fact is that before I go into answer your question, I just want to say that in U.S. television history, one of the roles that African American people have played is as a comic relief, right? And that is one of the ways that African American people show in television is in comedy, because they're not shown in serious shows. And when they are shown in a comedy, they were often shown as a comic relief between white people communicating about serious issues with each other, and and so they could be dismissed, right? And so we cannot forget that history within U.S. television. Now, where did Selena Gomez go? She's out with
She's never far from our thoughts.
Yeah, she's with Justin Bieber again. That's what she's doing right now. But the transnational aspect, we have to remember that, and I mostly study mainstream popular culture. It's produced primarily by 6 global conglomerates, right? And it is distributed all over the world. And when global conglomerates produce popular culture, they don't mean it to just be local, but they want it to go global. They want that extra profit. It's an intensely capitalist industry that is highly diversified, that seeks to dominate in any kind of context they're in. And so I have here Disney, because Disney is so good at it, right? And I don't know if you've read about Disney lately. Disney was just in the New York Times in the cover. I believe on Sunday, they have kind of gamed the Broadway ticket pricing system, right? Yeah. And so that The Lion King continues to be the most profitable show on Broadway, even though it's so old, because of the science between gaming the prices for Broadway shows that Disney has invested in. This is Disney. Disney is working as we breathe, I'm sure, to figure out what we all need tomorrow. Okay, I mean, they're just so brilliant. And this is a picture of Disney right here in the subte, which is in Buenos Aires, the subway. And I just take pictures as I travel around the world, and Disney is always everywhere. I always encounter, Hannah Montana kind of came and went, and whoever the latest Disney princess is. And so these are representations that are produced usually in the United States. But Disney, what Disney does is Disney borrows from every culture, right? So Mulan, Disney borrowed, and that what was a kind of a fairy tale within China, right? And Disney borrows the castle from Germany. So Disney is all about borrowing. And I'm using borrowing in quotes, right? Because it's the kind of borrowing that most of us would get in trouble for copyright violation, but Disney gets us in trouble for copyright violation. One of the other brilliant things about Disney. And so these kinds of representations are produced within a culture, which is the United States by and large. But Disney's very smart because they're thinking global distribution, right? They're thinking appealing to a global market. And so I argue that Disney has begun to include a lot of subtle ethnics, right, that will appeal to a global market without turning off the white mainstream in the United States. So you get somebody like Selena, who's subtly Latina, right? But by the time she goes global, that Latinidad is lost. That when you get to Greece, people just think she's a U.S. person. In fact, when I get to Finland, people think Jennifer Lopez is what everybody looks like in the United States, and that's why they want to move here, right? Because they want to really date Jennifer Lopez's, And so she represents U.S. beauty in a sense. And I must have been having a bad week when I sent this, because normally I send a booty picture, right? And so I don't know what I was thinking. There's the face of Jennifer Lopez. But so she represents, in the US, Latinidad and Latinas, but by the time she gets marketed broadly, she represents the US, right? But the US also exports narratives of race. We export all sorts of, racialized kinds of images, but race doesn't mean the same in every country. And so that, it's, again, the reason I go back to Disney is because Disney thinks about this, and Disney thinks of how the color of race, a Disney movie that some of you may have seen, how that will play in South Africa, right? And how that will market in South Africa, and how that becomes a top television show in South Africa because of the way that that is construed. Cheetah girls. Are any cheetah girl kind of people out there? I know you were never a fan, but maybe your little sister was. That's called a third person effect, Yeah, and cheetah girls are all about sisterhood, right? Are all about a multicultural sisterhood, and they appeal broadly to different segments of the population. So if you're in Greece, you can see a cheetah girl and think, I'm a little brown, I'm a cheetah girl, right? If you're in South Africa, you can be a cheetah girl. And if you're in the south of the US, you can also be a cheetah girl, because there is a little sliver there that can appeal to you. So what I think that we need to think about the way our popular culture represents us, but it's not as easy as you might think, because people don't necessarily look at this globally and think, oh my God, this is what's going on with race in the US, because they're interpreting it through their own racial system that they have in their own local context. I don't want to keep talking. Yeah, because I don't want to.
Nope, I don't have anything.
I guess the only thing that I would say is, I think she's right. The way that race gets played out in different countries is different, but I think we need to think about differences as well as similarities. And that the Europeans spread around the globe, there's certain patterns in the ways that race gets played out that are also similar to the way that race gets played out here. And so, although apartheid was much more rigid than Jim Crow here, there's certain similarities and patterns. Or the Australia, the schools for the indigenous to civilize the indigenous people look a lot like the Indian schools that we developed here in the United States. And so, yes, they're different, but they're also similar, and I think we need to keep both of those in mind. And so, when we look at race, it's both.
So in about 6 minutes-ish, we're going to start taking, we'll have sort of quick responses, reflections, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A, which is a way of saying that for people who are watching this and engaging with us, elsewhere virtually, that now is a good time to make use of the Twitter hashtag, which is NCA Conversations with an S, to send those questions in. One thing I notice in working with students, who are typically 17, 18-year-old, is that they'll come in and they'll say, I don't see race. Right. Race is not part of my world. Racism doesn't exist. It's this, it's my parents, my grandparents' generation, it's their concerns. And the more that people talk about race, I feel like that just kind of makes it exist, but really, why even have the conversation? Right. And in a place like this, in a room dedicated to clarifying the conversation around race, how would you respond, and this is an open question, to that person who says, well, we're in a post-racial society. We don't have to talk about race anymore.
Well, we're not in a post-racial society, and I do hear that a lot, and I understand where that comes from with young people. What I do is bring up, and I don't have them with me, I just simply lay out the statistics. All you have to do is lay out the statistics about housing, about jobs. The unemployment level for African Americans has been consistently, over the past 50 years, has not gone down, and has been consistently at recession levels, right? At the best times for America, African American unemployment has been at recession levels. We all know about juvenile justice, incarceration rates for African Americans, even given the same crime and the same criteria. Health problems, health equities, infant mortality, even when you adjust for class and income. Every major precursor for African Americans, the wealth gap has gotten worse in the past 50 years for African Americans and Latinos. Not talking about race does not address the continuing racial inequality and injustice of this society. And all you have to do is go into a Boston public school, which I do quite frequently, if you don't believe that these things continue to have import. So for some people, it is, I guess, a luxury to not see race. But for people who are living in a racially unjust neighborhood, unjust neighborhood, it is a luxury that we can't afford as a society, and we can't afford it as a society. So I struggle with this question a lot because my students say it all the time, and I understand the impact. And the irony is that the only racists left in America are people who talk about race, right? I was like, oh, you're racist because you just want to keep talking about race. Well, not talking about it is not going to fix the problem.
And I think that is a huge problem. It's this kind of reversal of, in fact, in getting ready, I looked at a 2011 study from Tufts and Harvard that said it surveyed both African Americans and whites about their view of racism, and they found the majority of whites believe that they have replaced blacks as the victims of racial discrimination.
Right.
And so I think that's also, just further evidence of what you're talking about. So it's not only not discussing those structural inequalities that are pervasive and increasing, but it's also when you discuss it, then the majority and the people of privilege feel that they are being attacked. And so that kind of defensive-ness makes it so impossible.
Right, and one thing that Tim Wise, I'm sure many of you know, the anti-racist educator, says when you talk about that kind of stuff is that there were polls, Pew polls, maybe not Pew polls, right, from the 1960s, in which the majority of Americans said, yes, everything is fine, right? That there's racial. So I mean, you can't go by what people perceive, I guess is the point. That there's racial equality in 1964 is laughable, and yet the majority of white Americans believed that there was. So the question is, we've got a lot of educating to do, and we have to start with our young people to talk about racial injustice. I think we need to define racist, because people, again, this is where people want to say there's no right, it's not de facto de jure racism, right? I mean, there's no sign saying color people anymore, and so people think, well, racism is over, and it's not about individual racism, and it's not about it's about racial injustice, and so I've said that.
It's about the way that it's being discussed in the public sphere, right?
Yes.
And so we're in the kind of era of the post, and it's not just about race; it's also about gender, right? We're post-feminism. We've gone women. What is wrong with women? Why do they keep bitching? And they always use the word bitching for women. I'm not, And what is wrong
now the
with
B word's
them?
bossy somehow.
Bossy. Now bossy.
And again, you look at the data, but this is not a data-driven public discourse.
No, you're
because
right.
if it were data-driven, we would be doing something about global warming and stuff like that, but we're not, And so the fact is that women still make 67 cents to the dollar. The fact is that women with a college degree have the same income potential as a male high school dropout. This is still the statistic that there's out there. So, but in the public discourse, it's been turned upside down so that the people that have privilege become the victim, and so this is why I think media. I'm a media scholar, and everybody here is more or less a media communication scholar. It's such an important area of study because representation is not about just fun and games. Representation is about share of resources. Representation is about what we value as a culture. Representation is about how we're going to distribute resources. Representation is about, will our children be able to do as well as we do? Representation is about, I don't want to go back to Danville prison and have to face a room of 100 men. I have them all be African American and Latinos, like I did 2 weeks ago. This is not a prison for African American and Latino men, but everyone that I gave a lecture to was African American and Latino. I don't want to go back there in 10 years and face that. And representation is about power. And representation is very important. I'll stop at that.
That's good.
It's a good place to stop.
Here's what I want to do next. I want everyone here to think about questions you have. So take a few seconds and think about questions you may have. I will now ask the panelists to just, in 30 or 40 seconds. Obviously, this is a very complex conversation, right? So I'm not asking for the tweet condensation, of this conversation. But what is, something, a lasting thought you want everyone to hold on to going into this Q&A?
Start with me, okay. I would say I have a slightly different take with my students, I guess, than some of the other panelists, because I show them some of the racist tweets. And we discussed who's doing the tweeting, and Jezebel, when they drilled down and identified who tweeted some of these things when the Boston Bruins lost to the Washington Flyers, and of course it's all the black players' fault, but that's a different issue. But it's young people. You know, it's high school students and college students. Primarily, this is who they identified when they revealed this. My mother doesn't know how to tweet. If I asked my mother to tweet, she wouldn't even know how to do it. And so it's not old people that are tweeting all of this racist stuff that's all over the internet. And so there isn't, I guess with my students, there isn't that denial that we're in a post-racial society or something. And I ask them, you know, why is this a young people problem? Because you're the future, and if this is a problem with young people, what does this say about where we're going, and when can we have these conversations?
Maybe the old people are all on Vine.
Reading the newspaper in print.
Well, I mean, that then also speaks to a connected point to what you were talking about. As the media landscape is changing and it's becoming more enclaved so that the people who produce media know exactly what I want and are kind of tailoring that message through different portals, it's going to not be a kind of dialogue where everyone's participating. It's going to be a dialogue. I mean, you can use the example of MSNBC and Fox. I mean, it's not a shared discussion. And so that, I think, is also a real constraint as we're moving forward. But I also want to kind of point to one moment of hope. I mean, I think that there's been some meaningful activism on behalf of immigrant rights that's been led by the church and the clergy. And I think that there's a history of clergy leadership making a difference in the public sphere. You have some clergy with immigrant rights coming forward. And so I also want to kind of end with a moment of hope and suggest that maybe that, if it's not going to happen in the media, maybe it's got to happen in these other spaces.
Yeah, I think I've said everything, honestly, that I have to say. But I would just pick up on your point to say I can get very frustrated and down about these conversations. So I think it's important to end on a note of hope. James Baldwin said, "We don't have the right to despair. Our children depend on us." I guess the main thing I would say is don't expect to be comfortable. Have these conversations and don't expect to be comfortable. I think if you eliminate the expectation that you should be comfortable, then we can have these conversations. You don't have a right to be comfortable. You have an obligation to engage these issues for yourself, for your children, for your society. And if you eliminate this idea that it is going to be uncomfortable, so what? So what? So once you take that, and I do that with my students, and I set that ground rules at the beginning, and we have great conversations. You know, there's safety and all that kind of stuff. We got to make it a safe place and all that kind of stuff. But there's a difference between safety and discomfort.
All right. I'm not comfortable right now, so I think I'm okay. So just to kind of build on everything, really youth people are young people are the future of the world. That would be most of you who are out there are youth. And so I guess my parting words are also hopeful, is that really nothing happens without human labor. Right? I think it's important to remember that, because a lot of times when you're thinking about the internet, you think it's wireless. But you know, the only way that it's wireless is because people came while you were on summer break and they wired your building so it could be wireless, right? And that was human workers who did that. So nothing happens without human labor, and that's really you guys, right? And so if you do nothing about things, it means that you're allowing things to happen that you might not agree with. So please, you know, I have hope. I have hope in you that you will make things continue to happen in a progressive manner, because I don't think that it's all bad out there. And part of the reason I always go back to Disney is because, you know what, people think of Disney as this big, like, bad conglomerate, but Disney made Mulan. You know, Mulan is a queer movie. And I came out of Mulan and I'm like, oh my God, queer Disney. Who would have thought, you know? And that happened. I'm not saying it's the most, like, you know, totally kind of revolutionary queer movie ever, but it's a queer movie, and it's so amazing. But nothing happens without human labor, and that is you, my friends. So you make it happen.
And I would just speak to the uncomfortableness, because that's, you know, I'm searching that out like a truffle every day. And, you know, as a comedy writer, you're basically like the storm chaser of social inappropriateness. You just want to get right in there. And so that's what I do. It's like, and a lot of it's looking inward. And I think for everybody too, which is a manner of discussion, is why do I feel that way? Let's talk about it. What we're doing in a writer's room is we're saying, I did this thing. It was, I didn't say it, but I thought it. And then you go, well, what if Larry said it? And so, you know, look, I mean, to sum up, I would say the reason why we get all these story ideas is because people are, in a sense, uniquely terrible. And so if everyone was just a little better, I'd be out of a job, but I'm getting ready to retire, so I'm hopeful also.
Thank you. It's now time for us to all have a more open conversation, including everyone here who's been fantastic audience. So please make use of the microphones on this side and that side. I have questions coming in from Twitter, which again, that's NCA Conversations. That's the hashtag. So if you have any questions, feel free to come up here. But as you're thinking about your question, I have a question right here that I'd like to ask, for the group. One question comes in from Twitter, and it says, 50% of the babies born today are minority. Is that a sign of progress?
Well, they're not a minority if there's 50%, so.
You're not out there.
That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I don't know, I don't even know how to answer that question. I am not a person, this leads into the discussion which we didn't even get a chance to get into about multicultural, multiracial identities and a multiracial society and all that kind of stuff. I happen to be the daughter of the mother of 2 biracial kids. They identify in some ways as biracial, and they very much identify in some ways as black. I don't think if people who say, oh, we're all going to get mixed up and that's going to solve the problem, we're all going to intermarry and have babies, beautiful brown babies, and that's going to solve the problem, I think are naive. So that is not going to solve the problem. So is it a sign of progress? I don't know. Is it going to solve the problem? No. That I can say unequivocally.
And you still have communities that are predominantly white, and then you have an influx, these hyper-growth communities that over the past, 10 years, you have an influx of a new immigrant group, and it's about that discomfort and those communities learning to evolve in a way that is cohesive and not violent.
And which is a good point that I would just say very briefly, even though we have a higher percentage, we still live in an incredibly segregated society, right? I think something like, I actually wrote that down, something like 75% of black children go to schools that are segregated. So we actually have more segregated education system than we did when I was going to school. It's true. So in some ways we're more multicultural, but in many ways we're as segregated a society as we ever have been.
Good question.
Hi, my name is Sarah Jackson. I'm faculty at Northeastern University here in Boston. I just wanted to ask a question about a little bit more about film in terms of representations of race in film at this particular moment. So 12 Years a Slave just won the Oscar for Best Picture of the Year, which I absolutely agree with. It was an amazing film. But I've been having a lot of conversations with my students lately, and actually with people in media, talking about the fact that there is still such a huge void of available roles for supposedly how multicultural of a society we are. And yet I asked my students today to name an Asian American lead actress who gets lead roles in movies and an Asian American lead actor who gets roles in movies, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't think of who those people were. And so I'm wondering if the way that we seem to be celebrating 12 Years a Slave and the change that it represents really represents a change, or if it's sort of this, we're still leaving these historical narratives in one place and not allowing people to be in spaces and telling contemporary stories.
Wow, that had like 15 layers to it. So I'm gonna just maybe touch a couple, because that's what we were instructed to do by a moderator. So, I think that one of the things that you said at the very end is that the U.S. in general is comfortable with talking about blackness in history, right? And so we can talk about 12 Years a Slave, or even The Blind Side as recent history, and then we can pat ourselves in the back and go, oh, we don't do that anymore. We have come such a long way. And so there's problems with that. There are twofold. As the person who accepted the Oscar for 12 Years a Slave mentioned, there has never been more slavery in the world than there is now. Okay, so there are more slaves in the world proportionally now than there were during the high slavery periods of the United States history. Okay, and then, and a lot of what's going on in some of these Hollywood narratives is the white savior narrative, right? So in 12 Years a Slave, even though I love Brad Pitt, I have a little soft spot for him in my heart. He comes in as the white savior there. You have the white savior narrative in The Blind Side. You have the white savior narrative in or what the Emma Stone one going down.
The Help.
The Help. You know, so
Let's not
you
talk
keep
about
get
that.
yeah. But so so you are getting some representation, but in terms of some of the traditional narratives that both reiterate the white savior kind of narrative, as well as place it in the past that allows us to act and to shed our collective white liberal guilt. That's one way I would answer that, although there were many, many other layers.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, you might know this, I think that there's a recent UCLA study that found that actually entertainment that shows a diverse cast is actually a moneymaker. It's a reason, like they proved it. And so I'm wondering if that will then open things up. I'm not sure, but I do think that for a long time there was this presumption of, well, we're not going to have that kind of diversity because it's only going to be, one community that sees that. But now that more and more shows and films come and prove that kind of money-making quality, I don't know if the economics will make a difference.
Well, the economics, for movies that's a movie that's separate from your mainstream movie,
right.
which is based on bankability. And, for a while, Will Smith was the most bankable star on the globe, and his movies made more money than anyone, especially as all the other older people started to fall away. But at the same point, 12 Years a Slave, amazing movie, is seen by the people who can either, engage in liberal hand-wringing, but all the people who are still feeling that way aren't seeing it. Basically, anyone who would have looked at that movie and called it 12 Years of Lazy People didn't see it and is never going to appreciate it. So it's a very specific niche movie in a way. But in terms of so what I'm saying is that's not getting more black actors into mainstream roles.
No.
That is,
Right.
look at Daimon Hansu, who seemed like
he's
an amazing actor. He seemed like he was, you need a slave, get Diamond. He was, whether it was Amistad or whatever, it's like, and those are the roles he had. But I do think, and I'm not defending that mainstream Hollywood system, but it's all about can this star make me money? And I honestly think in that way, it's fairly colorblind. If there's a hit, everyone in Hollywood is, basically, one comedian once said, it's trying to get struck by lightning by running and hugging the tree that just got hit. So it just takes a little bit of success to engender more opportunity.
But part of it is the way that we read these images, and do we read them? It's okay to have African Americans or Asian Americans in some historical piece, but is there going to be an Asian American to be the Bachelor?
Right.
Right.
She laughs.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I do. I laugh. Yeah.
Before we take this question, just to add on to this conversation, Monica Ndunu-White, who teaches at Tufts University here in Boston, is actually doing a study. And she's a book that she's working on that looks at sort of the profitability of casts, sort of film casts, that are majority minority, right? So that's an ongoing conversation. That's a local resource, and hopefully that book will be out sometime soon. The second thing is that I teach MFA writing students, so screenwriting students, and one of the things that they often tell me is that the advice they receive, which is not particular to my institution, is not to write race unless it's fundamental to the story. Right, so you get 12 Years a Slave, which obviously calls for a certain number of African American actors or black actors, but then you have other texts, other sort of film texts that you're creating, and if race isn't sort of critical, to that character's description, then leave it out. Right, this way it creates maximum possibility for a casting director to.
But that
do
goes
their
back
own
to the
thing.
invisibility of whiteness, right? Because if
It's the
race
default.
of a character isn't specified, it
Exactly.
gets cast as a white character.
Exactly, and the default assumption then becomes that this character is white. So you think about Denzel Washington, the story goes that Denzel Washington, he always plays these roles that were written for white actors, right? And actually, he plays a lot of roles that weren't written, where the character wasn't actually named as being white. It was just an unraced character, right? As opposed to when Denzel Washington played in Glory.
Right.
Question.
Hi, Janet Kolodzy in the journalism department here at Emerson. My question, we started out really talking about social media and Twitter and Vine and Snapchat and et cetera, which are all really very short, quick hit, and then we've said they're not giving us the deliberative discussions that we need. Are we really asking too much out of that platform? And I'm a little bit, Anne, you kind of sort of were talking about there's ways in which it can be done, but are we really sort of putting a burden on a platform that isn't really designed for that? It really is designed for quick and dirty, and let's all, you know, be crazy and wild, and kind of like, that's sort of the way it's played out so far. So I guess my question might be, are we asking too much of the platform? Do we really think that it perhaps can change, or do we need to figure out a way in which the quick and dirty becomes moving into other platforms in relation to the deliberations? Because I think that's the step that hasn't happened.
Right. Yes.
I would say it has. I slightly disagree. I think it has happened. But I think because Twitter is so short, you can see the incredible explanatory power of race to explain all kinds of phenomenon. And yes, because it's limited to 140 characters, there's really not room there for deliberation. But on other websites, there was a discussion about the Super Bowl ad, or about, you know, this sports games. You know, people really get emotional about sports, and race explains why its team won or lost. But it's amazing that on some of these other sites there are longer discussions that where people actually do engage. But the Twitter just gives you that real quick. It is quick, but it gives you the temperature of what's going on and how powerful race and other things are in explaining what's going on in the world.
And I mean, I think transmedia storytelling is basically going to reshape a lot of activism, and then also kind of more serious discussion, so that it's not ever going to be assumed to be on one medium, so that when documentary filmmakers are working with activists, you're not really going to get funded unless you have a kind of outreach program that's multifaceted, that incorporate, I mean, like, think of something like The Cove. You've got to have the Twitter, you've got to have the PSA that's on YouTube, and it's got to be that transmedia where people, it's almost like taking something like The Matrix, but applying it to an activist conversation about race. You might not get them in the video game, but maybe you'll get them somewhere else. And so I think thinking about these alternative platforms, and that not expecting to get everything out of Twitter, but maybe that's the hook, that you make it easy enough with some kind of affordance that it easily links to something else, that then gets you those additional conversations that are more meaningful.
That would be great. Anything to get people to stop taking pictures of what you're eating. we don't need it. We've eaten. It's not exciting.
Not
but
even
people
cupcakes?
can use
not even cupcakes.
Facebook and some of these others, and give URLs that link to other.
Yeah.
It's not just it by itself.
Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Benny Sato Ambush. I'm on the faculty of the Department of Performing Arts here at Emerson College, and thank you all. And thank you, Richard, for this really important conversation. I'm thinking about Eartha Kitt tonight. When I was an incredible actress, singer, performer, entertainer, who I'm sure had more than a share of obstacles that she had to contend with in her life. I'm remembering when I was much younger, this may have been in the late 60s, early 70s, it was a talk show that she was on, and with emphasis she claimed that she was a raceless artist. I remember having a very strong reaction at that time. What do you make of that? I know you're hearing this out of context from the whole conversation that she was in, but, and if you can extend that to any person, a Latino, an Asian, a Native American, saying that, what do you make of something like that, a statement like that?
Well, Morgan Freeman said the same thing, didn't he? Didn't Morgan Freeman say, I'm not a black actor, I'm just an actor, I'm a man, I'm not a man? It reminds me of that Sidney Poitier and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, right? Your problem is you think of me as a black man. You know, individual artists have the right to declare themselves whatever. I situate myself, I'm a novelist, I'm an artist, I situate myself firmly and directly in the African American tradition. My concern when I hear that, and it's, you know, this goes back to the Harlem Renaissance and the Jug and the Langston Hughes. We've been having this debate forever, so it's not a new debate, and people have the right to fall down where they may on that line. My only concern when I hear that is whether that's a denial of the possibility of African American life as being universal. Right? So, you know, Philip Roth doesn't say I'm not a Jewish writer, because he can write very firmly in the Jewish tradition and understand that that speaks to the universal human condition. And because I understand completely and utterly that there is nothing in the world in the universal condition that cannot be represented in African American life, I have no problem declaring myself a black writer. So that's where I come down on that. I don't know, and God forbid I should criticize Eartha Kitt, who was hot, right? So I'm not saying that, but that's where I stand.
And just a sort of personal sort of note, when I was in grad school at Cornell, Benny came in and directed Twilight Los Angeles, I believe. And yeah, that was like 15 years ago or something like that. It was a while ago. And then that was the case, right, where it facilitated a series of conversations related to sort of race and identity using theater, right? There's a question I have from Facebook. And here's the question. I want to read it in its entirety. It would be interesting to hear from the panelists what new, within quotes, new, logics of race are now apparent in the media and popular culture. Since race is constantly reworked to meet larger national needs, sure, some new contours of race/racism must have emerged. What are your thoughts on this?
I know from a writing standpoint, you try to be an equal opportunity offender. And so we've certainly done stories about African Americans. We also, but you try to hit everybody, including white people. And we did a story recently where two of our guys on the league went to a sushi restaurant, great sushi restaurant. They sit at the bar and they are very unpleasantly surprised that their sushi chef is white. And nobody wants to go to the white sushi chef. He speaks fluent Japanese, everyone else respects him, but you just, something's not right about that. And so they make an excuse and go, and it leads to a whole other story. But it's just, it goes every direction. One other one, which I think was sort of an empowering story. It won't seem like it at first, but it really is. Dealt with a Chinese mentally handicapped person, and the story was a very simple story, which is he may know, if you're in a Chinatown or you're in China or somewhere where no one speaks English, he may know 50 words of Chinese, you know none. So he's much smarter than you, much more able to get along. He can, if you're at a restaurant, he can ask where the bathroom is. He can ask for butter. You can't. Who's the dummy? And so it actually ended up being a very empowering story. As this Chinese mentally handicapped person is laughing at our guys who end up washing their hands in the urinal and all this other fun stuff. But you're always, I think the whole thing spins around. It's everybody's guilty, I guess, and so you just keep taking shots.
I don't want to jump on you. I feel like I've been jumping on you all night. But so
That's all right.
let me just.
I'm used to it.
Let me push back against that a little bit.
Just it's like 30 seconds.
30 seconds. The new contour is the idea that there can be equal opportunity offense. You cannot. That's an ahistorical idea. You can't. There's no such thing. That would have to negate history. Louis C.K. makes a good point about that. I won't quote him about. He says, what are you even going to call white people? Honky, taking me back to the day I owned slaves, right? Like, there's nothing. There is no such thing as equal opportunity offense in a historical reality. Sorry, is that quick enough?
That's good.
Yeah.
We're at a moment now where we're going to wind things down. This has been a fantastic conversation. I want to leave us with a few comments. Before I do that, there was one question that we didn't get to, and I feel as though I want to leave it floating in the air for conversation in the cybersphere and also here. And someone asked about Obama, President Obama, and whether or not the opportunity was fully utilized to create/perform a transracial politics, or society. So that's just leave that out there in the air. What this conversation has done is it's taken us across a variety of topics, right? So we looked at how race operates within the Twitter sphere, right? We talked about how the rapid increase in communications, the quick sharing of tweets, the barrage of more and more people sort of agreeing, which could sort of support a politics, but also could pile on and oppress and silence people, is something that's happening today, right? We looked at how the people who are often using Twitter are this younger generation, and there's this sort of weird thing that's occurring, right, where you have a younger generation that avows themselves as being post-racial, but often can use Twitter and the anonymity of it to sort of push, a prejudiced discourse, right? We talked about that. We talked about how hard it is to talk about race and identity in American culture, and how difficult that could be. We talked about how comedy, offers an outlet in part because of its many ways of interpreting and engaging the issue, right? But most importantly, we talked about how hard it is for us to take a time to remind everyone of the importance of being in their own bodies, and their lived subjectivity, and being aware of their social identity, and how there's many aspects of ourselves that we're dealing with every second of the day. Gender, race, health, class, all these other factors, and they all inform our point of view. And our goal is to always remind ourselves of how complicated we are, how we all live in the world, and then when we engage other people, we will make mistakes in talking about their different experiences, but treat it as a learning experience, right? Treat it as a chance to learn more about another person, acknowledge the fact that nothing will change unless we have a conversation. And if we do that, then things might shift for the better, for the positive. So please join me in thanking these 5 amazing panelists. And the last thing I would do is ask Rich to come back up here again, please. Come back here. Because this has been his presidential initiative, and the fact that you were committed to this conversation, allowing us to be here in this space, having all of NCA, the staff and support, to allow us to spend time together and talk to one another is really important. And I just want to acknowledge how crucial your presence has been at NCA, and how this conversation is made possible because of you. So please join me in thanking Rich. And we're done. Thank you.